So last week we began our series in the book of Ruth. It's a little 4-chapter book in the Old Testament, and if you have your Bibles, you want to find it. It's right before the book. It's right after the book of Judges in the Old Testament, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. But last week we started this series called Redeemed Hope in the Unexpected. And because we are the redeemed of Christ, because we belong to Christ Almighty, because we are believers, because we are Christians, whatever followers of Christ, whatever name you want to put on it, there's been a time in your life where you have accepted Christ as your Savior. You are redeemed. That's what the word redeemed means. You have been purchased. You have been bought with a price, and now you belong to God Almighty. Well, because of that, you can anticipate hope in the unexpected, in the most unexpected places. And we're using the little book of Ruth to find this out. Last week we were in Ruth chapter 1, and we saw how Naomi and Ruth had kind of hit a hard time. They returned back to Bethlehem. They were empty. They were broken. But there was a small glimmer of hope that we ended with last week, because the harvest of barley had began. And it showed us that God is always working behind the scenes. A great radio preacher of days go by, and he also pastored out in California, Pasadena, California, Dr. J. Vernon McGee. And his commentary on the book of Ruth, he said that these 4 little chapters is a beautiful brochure, a bright brochure against a blackened backdrop, because every chapter of those 4 chapters of Ruth bring hope and show you how God is working in some of the most unexpected ways, in some of the most miraculous ways, to take care of his people. Now today we're going to step over into Ruth chapter 2. Each week we're taking a chapter of Ruth in the month of February, and we're going to see how that God's provision, how he'll meet your needs, whatever that need is. It's a financial need, if it's a need for wisdom in your life, if you need direction in your life, if you're needing a job, if you're needing something in your family, whatever it might be, God will provide for that, often in ways that we least expect. Sometimes we find ourselves in life where we're in a season when we don't know how things are going to work out. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of apprehension. But we're going to find out today that even though the way forward isn't clear, in those moments of apprehension, in those moments of uncertainty, God's grace will fill those gaps. Now, as I was studying for this message, I thought of all these wonderful definitions of grace that I've heard throughout my life as a Christian, and my 40-something years of being a pastor and going to Bible college and seminary and all those different things. And there's many wonderful definitions of grace. But I wanted something that was kind of personal for me. So I sat down and I thought, well, when I think of God's grace, there's the acronym God's riches at Christ's expense, which many preachers has used. It's God's unmerited favor, which that's certainly a good definition. But I wanted something that matched my down-home approach to life. And here's what I came up with: that grace is God's goodness and blessings freely given to us. He doesn't hold them back. They're freely given to us, though I don't deserve them. I like to make things personal. My preacher in Mississippi always said, that's why I never point my finger, Jason, when I'm preaching. I'm not a pounder preacher doing like this, because my pastor always told me, Brother Marsh, just remember, when you're pointing your finger, you got one at them, but you got 3 more pointing back at you. So you're getting triple than what you're giving them. So I never point my finger, and I never pound the pulpit. But grace is God's goodness and blessings given to me. You can make it personal, because grace is for you today. Grace is for every person in this room, those online. Grace is extended to the entire world, but it's up to us whether or not we want to accept that gift of grace. We make the choice. We talked about that last week, how important choices are when we're in dark seasons. Your choices will make or break your future. The choices you make today will affect what you experience tomorrow. But grace is God's goodness toward me, though I don't deserve them, and I could never earn them. But it's this grace, this goodness and blessings of God, that fills the gaps in my life when I'm in a time of apprehension, uncertainty, I'm not sure what's going to happen. Here's what I found: God always has another move. There's an evangelist friend of mine. He's worldwide. I mean, he's traveled. He's done all kinds of, big things or whatever. I say big things. He's been on all the major platforms and I was with him in a meeting years ago. They had me come do music. I don't know why, because he's a musician, but nevertheless, I think I was like the warm-up maybe. I don't know why I was there. And I still thought, he's had all these big #1 hits and stuff, and there I am singing, opening up for his service. But he said he gave a story that day, and it's always stuck with me, and I thought of this when I put that in my notes. God always has another move. He was playing chess. Now, I don't play chess. I don't even know why you play chess. But he was playing chess on an airplane on his laptop computer. And he said, man, he thought he had won. And he said he had all of his, if you play chess, you may understand. I liked what he finally got around to saying. But he said, I had all of my stuff there, and I thought, buddy, I am ready. I have got this thing won. He says, and when I hit that enter button, it says, the king has another move. And I thought, that's what you need to think about in life. It may seem like you have become checkmated by the devil. It may seem that you're in a corner and you're never going to get out. But understand this, the king always has another move. Because it's in those moments, my friend, that God's grace, his blessings and goodness that I don't deserve and I couldn't earn them and I could never pay for them, it's those moments that grace is going to fill the gap. Here's what one of my favorite authors and preachers from days goes by said. Dr. Norman Vincent Peale says, listen, when you have exhausted all possibilities, you haven't. Let me say that again. When you've exhausted all possibilities, you haven't. You may think you've exhausted all possibilities. You may think you've come to the end of the road. We talked about it last week. We went from setbacks to comebacks. When you think you have exhausted all possibilities, there's no way, there's no other avenue, you haven't. Why? The king always has another move. His grace fills the gap. So, with those being said, let's walk through Ruth chapter 2 this morning. And as I was reading this week, it's going to be hard for me not to insert some little preacher moments in here, but I'm going to hold myself to what I know we need to talk about. So in Ruth chapter 2, now again, I'm in the New Living Translation, and you can read whatever version you have, or if you have an app called the YouVersion, you can read all kinds of versions. But I encourage you to have a copy of something that you can study later. But here's what it says in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now, there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Now, we're going to find it interesting that within 3 verses, we find that out twice, and there's a reason why. One day, Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest field to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, it was interesting last week. We saw that Ruth and Naomi, Ruth was from the country of Moab, and Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 boys had went there because there was a famine in Bethlehem, and so Elimelech said, well, let's go from a place called House of Bread to a place called Wastebasket. And that's exactly what he did. But we can't judge him because we've all done the same thing. We've been right in the middle of God's blessing and provision, and when it seems like the brook would dry up and it seemed like things were running low, we pack up and we go somewhere that's actually worse than where we started. If we'd have just waited patiently for the Lord, something great would have happened. But again, grace fills the gap. Because even though they had a very difficult time, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem. Ruth said, I'm going to go with you. And we saw last week that just as they arrived at Bethlehem, it was the time of harvest. So it was the time that the famine was going to be over in Bethlehem, and a new chapter was about to be written in Ruth and Naomi's life. Now as we come into chapter 2 here, they still in a difficult situation because things haven't changed overnight. If you've ever went and harvest, you don't just harvest it and just start enjoying it. There's still some work and some processing. And in this time, widows, which Ruth and Naomi both were, they had very few options. They didn't have the social benefits that we have today. They didn't have something you could apply for and get some type of resources. You were really on your own. This is why Naomi had told Ruth and her other daughter-in-law Orpah to go back to your people, because I'm going to go back home and basically fall on the mercy of my family, because I have no other choice. My husband's dead, my sons are dead. I have no other choice. But Ruth, I love this. She comes back to this place she's never known before, but she loves Naomi and she loves the God that Naomi serves. And when Ruth gets back there, listen, she doesn't sit around. She doesn't just sit around and wait and just kind of, well, que sera, sera, whatever may be. No. Ruth takes the initiative and asks Naomi if she can go out in the fields and get the leftovers. Because, there's always a little something left when you go out and harvest something. No matter how large your garden is or how small your garden is, there's always a little something left. And you're only talking about 2 ladies anyway. So Ruth is saying, I'm not hired by anybody. I don't have a job. But I'm going to go out into a field that will allow me to, and I'm going to glean. I'm going to pick up whatever gets left behind. And perhaps we will have enough to get by day by day. But here's what I want you to see about Ruth. Not only did she have the faith to follow the God of Naomi, to follow her back to Bethlehem, she took the initiative. Friend, may I tell you something? Faith always takes the initiative. Faith makes that phone call. Faith sends that email. Faith takes that step. Faith puts that application in. Faith creates that resume and sends that resume out. Faith, that's me knocking on the door. Do you understand that, Ricardo? You're like, oh, he's knocking. He's knocking on the pulpit. I thought he didn't pound on the pulpit. That's a knock. That wasn't a pound. And this technically is not a pulpit. So it's all working out, isn't it great? Ricardo says, I'm going to go back to the sound room where you can't see me. Leave me alone, Pastor. So, but faith takes the initiative. And this is one of the things that I want you to see. This is why God can begin to bring hope in the unexpected, because Ruth began to put into practice what Hebrews 11 says. Paul said that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Their cupboards were bare. They had nothing on the table. But she says, I'm going to go to a field where they're harvesting barley, this new harvest, and I'm going to believe that I have enough, just enough maybe, to get home with. But then there's something else. We see God working. We see the king always taking another move. Because we go on down into verse 3, and it says that, so Ruth went out to gather grain, and as it happened. Isn't it interesting when you take a step of faith, as it happened? One translation says, as it turned out. Again, many of you are new, and some of you have been with us for a while, and I can only tell the stories that I've experienced. So if you get tired of them, then, I don't know what to do. But anyway, I don't know, because it's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But, we were in a situation much like we are, but on Vine Street, smaller, but had no parking. Now there's a parking garage where we used to park and walk 2 blocks down. But anyhow, there was no parking, and we had more steps than we have here, and it just... And so, we were always looking and just believing and reaching out to all of our realtor friends. And, we was doing everything that we were taking the initiative. And I'll never forget the day that I wasn't doing anything ministry related. I was on duty with the police department that day. And I was up at St. Susanna's working the festival. And that gentleman comes up to the table. And as it happened, our conversations turned to schools. I don't know how that happened. I mean, everybody's there for the ribeye steak sandwich on Friday night, and I'm there making sure they don't take the red Solo cups into the Duke parking lot, because Duke doesn't want you out there with your red Solo cup. So I was the heavy that said, you can't take that out, and you ought to have seen them. Okay, well, make it to your car. I'm not picking you up, okay? You just, buddy, go ahead. But that was my job, and so... anyway, I'm standing there and we're just doing what we're doing and just greeting people, giving away free junk or whatever, and, junk. And this guy and I start talking, and he says, yeah. Somehow we got talking about school. My son was coming maybe to eat, and I said something. He said, yeah, unfortunately, my son's school just closed down. That's weird. I said, what school does he go to? Oh, he goes to the little Christian school over in St. Luke. Really? And what he didn't know, but God knew, is every Sunday morning when I drove from Walnut Hills, where we lived there next to Ed and Christie, I would come Stafford to Simmon, down Raymond, down St. Luke, to Buchanan, down to Vine Street. And don't go across Vine Street on 40 weekdays. You'll never make it across. But you can do it on a Sunday morning. When Sunday morning's coming down, you can do it. If you're any other time, you want to go to Center because you'll never get out at Vine Street. But anyway, that's just the way I'd make it. And I was drive by here and I thought, man, that's the building we need. That is, in fact, I'd even reached out to the minister then, Marcus Dodrell, who was the minister up here at the church at Lawndale and Buchanan, then Calvary. And I knew him from some other things that I'd done in the community. And said, hey, would you be interested in renting? No, it's all set up with walls for the school. This was a big room, had a wall here, and that was the principal's office, if you can imagine. And I mean, it was just, it just was not, we were better off staying in Bethlehem, amen? Because at that point, that would have been a Moab to have rented that. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But that's 2 or 3 years earlier. And then one day, but I would drive by and just continuously just look and just look. Didn't know all this other stuff was with it. I just was looking at this. As it happened, I signed up for extra duty to work the St. Susanna Festival. And as it happened, there's a man there. And as it happened, we began to talk about schools. Don't know why. But as it happened, he tells me his son's school is closing down. And as it happened, it was this building. And as it turned out, Monday, while I was on duty, I drove by, and there was the principal out there. And I said, hey, I hear you're closing the school. Yeah. What are you going to do with the building? I think we're going to sell it. Really? Who would I talk to? He said, well, I don't know what they're wanting, but if you go right up there, because they had a new minister, Brother Raleigh, he said, go right up there and talk to him. Well, I go up there. He's not there, so I leave one of my cards. I left official town card, so it looked really important. And I said, would you please give me a call? This is not official, but I'd like to talk to you. Well, that really gets somebody stirred up when they see a police shield on a card. That kind of makes, I think I better call this guy. And so he calls me, and the next thing you know, within a week, we were looking at the building, and so that was in June, St. Susanna Festival. In September, they handed us the keys to this building, as it happened. Now, I tell myself those kinds of stories, my friends, because it helps you to get a hold of what God is wanting to do in your life. Faith takes the initiative. You see, from Ruth's perspective, she just happened to show up in Boaz's field. But you see, this was not a coincidence. This was God's providence. This was God's planning. See, here's the thing. Ruth could have left her past losses keep her stuck. But instead, she stepped forward in faith because God was already working ahead, opening doors that she didn't even know were being opened. See, maybe right now you're in a season where you don't see a way forward. Maybe you're in a situation where you don't know where the next answer is going to come from. But I'm telling you, don't let fear keep you from knocking on that door, from sending that email, from putting in that resume, from dropping off that application, for submitting that text, for answering that call, because that may be God setting you up to put you right in the middle of your Boaz's field. God may be opening doors for you you don't even realize yet, because grace opens doors. Secondly, God's grace will always provide more than you expect. Remember, Ruth went out just hoping to glean, to come back with a handful of grain. But now we see here in Ruth chapter 2, notice with me, in verse 4, while she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, who's that young woman over there? And who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she's the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters, and she's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, you stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other field. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they've drawn from the well. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? She said. That's grace, friend. I'm only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done. And now go down here in verse 15. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. So she sat down with the harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted. Now remember, she's going out to get what? Just enough. But she's coming back eating all she wanted and had some left over. Reminds me of Mark chapter 6, where the disciples went out and they fed the 5,000, and when it got done, they had 12 baskets of leftovers. But he goes on, and when Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time. That's God's grace. You see, Boaz is a wealthy, respected man here in Bethlehem, and he noticed Ruth, and so he asked about Ruth, and so he approaches her with kindness, not with any, conditions with it, not with any ulterior motives. He approaches her with grace, with true God-like kindness, and tells her to stay in the fields where you'll be safe. Nobody's going to harm you. Nobody's going to mess with you. Then he goes on and he instructs his workers to leave extra grains for her. See, this is more than generosity, friend. This is a reflection of God's heart for his people. God's always working behind the scene. Here's what I love about this, and I've been kind of getting it around to you. Ruth, listen, came looking for scraps, but God gave her more than enough. That's the kind of God we serve. See, Ruth had every reason to be hopeless. Her last few years had not been the greatest, but God's grace was already at work. He had brought her into the family of Elimelech and Naomi, who served the God of Israel. Naomi went back to Bethlehem, getting ready for what God had in store. Ruth chose to go and believe in God. What Naomi, and here's what I want you to understand as you start this new week, what Naomi thought was just another day hoping for enough to get by was God's appointment with her to bless her abundantly. Every time you get up and you begin a new day, that's why the psalmist said, this is the day the Lord has made. I'll rejoice and be glad in it. Because though you might think of it, it's just another Monday. Just another manic Monday, oh. I wished it were a Sunday, oh. That's my fun day. Okay, so anyway, you might think it's just another Monday. It's just another Tuesday. I thought it was just another detail at St. Susanna's. I thought it was just another festival we had to work. I thought it was just another thing I had to do. But God was setting not me up, but the entire ministry of Christ Church. And I believe that's what's happening right now. God's working behind the scenes. And I believe our next move is going to come suddenly, and it's going to come unexpectedly, but it's going to have God's thumbprint written all over it. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. Matter of fact, there's a great album on iTunes you might look up called Beyond Your Dreams, a young strapping Christian country artist that traveled the world in parts of Canada. And the album's title is from Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20 in the Amplified, where it says, now unto God that is able to superabundantly do all that you ask or think, and even beyond your highest prayer, your highest thought, and even beyond your dream. See, the NLT says God is able to accomplish infinitely more than we could all ask or think, beyond your dreams. And finally, listen. So God's grace opens doors. God's grace always provides more than plenty, but God's grace gives us a glimpse of his redemption. How that he's always working on our behalf. You know that big word redemption, it just means that God's on your side. You belong to God. He's watching out for you. He's taking care of you. Like I take care of my kids. I take care of my kids, and now I got a little grandboy. I'm going to be taking care of that grandboy. I'm watching over that grandboy. Why? Because they're part of my family. You know, I've told you guys, they walk in my house. They know where my stash of Diet Mountain Dew is. They don't have to ask, you know. Abby still does. Hey, Dad, can I have a Diet Dew? Honey, you don't have to ask. You know where it's at. It's mine. Well, those are yours. No, there's ours because you're in the family. Now, Bill, if you come over, you'll have to ask. You don't just go up in there. I'll run you out on a rail, buddy, is what I'll do. Have you for trespassing is what I'll do. But anyway. No. But now listen here in Ruth chapter 2. We're going to wrap this up. So Ruth gathered barley there all day until when the heat when the heat and the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. Do you see this picture? She was just wanting a handful, coming home with a basket. Now it gets better. Can it? Yeah. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the toasted grain that was left over for meal. Man, she brought herself a doggy bag home, gave it to her mother. Now listen, where did you gather all this grain? Naomi said, where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. Now remember, Naomi was the one in the latter part of verse 1. Naomi, supposed to be the daughter of God, she said, just start calling me Mara. I'm bitter. I'm bitter. But see, even when you think you have a right to get bitter, God's going to give you a reason to get better. But you know what? It's still a choice. So Naomi's starting to have a heart change, and she's beginning to make a choice, because notice what she says. May the Lord bless the one who helped you. In the first chapter, she's blaming God. Well, God's made me bitter. God's done me wrong. God's done something bad. No, God didn't do that, but God's the one on your side. Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she worked, and she said, the man I work with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him. Naomi told her daughter-in-law, listen, he is showing his kindness, his grace to us, as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our kinsman redeemers. So Ruth comes home with this abundance. Naomi is shocked and she's excited. That's how people are. You know, when God does something on your behalf, how did that happen? I can't believe that, everything. Well, that's just God being God. He's showing himself strong on behalf of his people. And he says, may the Lord bless him. That man is one of our family. See, suddenly Naomi realizes God is up to something bigger than I thought. She came back to Bethlehem with her head down and, as we call down south, dragging her tail between her legs. Well, I'm just bitter now. I'm not Naomi. Just call me Mara. I'm bitter. I'm bitter. Just call me Droopy Dog. I'm so happy. You know? So, but here's the thing. Ruth went out, just thought, I'm just going to gather some grain and maybe things will work. But she took the initiative. Take the initiative. Faith takes the initiative. Naomi thought, we'll just get by. If Ruth can just bring home a little grain, we'll ground it up, and maybe within a little bit of time we'll have some bread. But all that time, God is orchestrating something greater, a story in the making of his goodness and his hope. You see, Boaz showed the way by demonstrating God's kindness and provision, pointing forward to what Jesus was going to do. In Ephesians says in Ephesians chapter 2 that he might show us kindness, the kindness toward us in these last days. See, we live in that grace today that Ephesians 2 says. See, sometimes we don't recognize what God is doing in our moment, but his plan is always unfolding. The king always has another move. You may seem you're at a dead end. You may seem you're at a place that there's no hope. The king always has another move. So here's what I want you to take home with you today. God's grace always opens doors even when you don't see the way forward. God's grace is always opening doors. It might be the next phone call you get. It might be in your mailbox right now and you haven't went and checked your mail. Might swing by there on the way home, all right? It might be an email that you're going to get this week. It might be an appointment that you're just, like I don't do breakfast appointments, so don't ask me. Carla does all my breakfast appointments. I don't go out for coffee. I don't enjoy going for coffee. I don't enjoy having breakfast. But if you need something, we'll help you. But I'm not going to go out for breakfast, all right? But we might meet along the way. You know, we might, well, yeah, come on by the church or something, you know, and we'll talk. Just understand, God may be setting you up for something great, because God's grace always provides more than we expect. His blessings always exceed our limitations. And here's what I found. God's grace is always filling the gaps, even when I don't see it, even when I don't feel it. His grace is already at work. His goodness and blessings that I don't deserve, that I could not earn and I could never pay for, is filling the gaps to bring me where He wants me to be, to have what He wants me to be, and to be who He wants me to be, in Jesus' name.